are going to get through the more famous chunk of World War II. I will attempt to move through this expeditiously, but as you can probably tell, I get a little excited and then it goes long. But, you're stuck at home. I have a captive audience. So I will attempt to go through the brief strokes of this, and then when we get back, if you are so interested, um, as you will be able to see it a picture somewhere hidden throughout this video, um, I've got books you can borrow, and I'm happy to make recommendations. So, um, the first chunk of 1944 in Europe is largely spent in Italy for the Americans and the British, and kind of waiting out all the nastiness that's happening in Poland in the case of the Russians. So 1944, as we think of it, does not really kick into gear in Europe until June. So on June 6th, 1944, we are going to have an event called D-Day. The D in D-Day literally stands for day. D-Day is day day. And that means this is the day that everything is kicking off. It is the start of what is called Operation Overlord, which is the code name for the invasion of northern France right here. And the eventual push, as you can see, this is how it kind of works out, down towards Paris, which would be kind of where your keyboard is right now. This is a massive Allied invasion involving the armies of the Americans, the British, and the Canadians. Parts of it will go very well. Parts of it will go poorly. This entire thing is planned by General Eisenhower and enacted by a number of lower-ranking generals on the ground. For example, the invasion at Utah Beach, which is over here, goes relatively smoothly. It is in fact run by one of Theodore Roosevelt's sons, who wins a Medal of Honor for walking up the beach with a cane because he had a limp, and leading his troops through relatively light German opposition and taking what is called the Cotentin Peninsula up here. You might have heard of Pointe du Hoc. That's up in this area as well. But long story short, the Americans and this chunk, so Utah Beach North, are going to cut off what few Germans there are up here. The nastiness is going to occur down in this area right here, especially right here at Omaha Beach. This is led by General Bradley, who we've talked about before. What happens at Utah Beach is the Germans were aware that the Allies would be invading at some point. Hitler built what he called the Atlantic Wall, which was a series of reinforced bunkers with machine guns and occasionally large guns to fire at the ships coming across the English Channel, which is right here. And it was very, very hard for the troops to land. And when they landed, especially at Omaha Beach, they were cut down by massive amounts of machine gun fire. Kind of like the Sherman tank, the Americans were able to produce a lot of weapons quickly, but the quality of those weapons compared to those of the Germans was lesser. It's kind of a trade-off you make. The more production you get, the more quality drops. That's not to say American weapons were bad, but they did not have the rate of fire that the Germans had on their machine guns. If you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan, that takes place starting at Omaha Beach. Also a very good recommendation for your movie extra credit if you're still looking for something there. That might be on Amazon, I'm not sure. Also, while we're talking about that sort of stuff, Band of Brothers is another great thing, and if you want to pick 2 episodes from that and do that rather than a movie, I'm okay with that. So, Omaha Beach is the roughest, but it is bad all around. But eventually, this takes place over about a month and a half. The Americans and their British allies are going to push down the peninsula in what is called Normandy, France, and eventually lock up the Germans in what is called the Fillet Pocket right here. And eventually, some Germans will escape, but a number of them will be captured. And we're talking by late July, early August, the Germans in northern France have essentially been neutralized. This is in part to a good degree because the Allied air forces, so that is the U.S. Army Air Corps, the Air Force doesn't exist yet, and the RAF, the Royal Air Force, have basically knocked the Luftwaffe out of the war. The German pilots are either not there or they're too afraid to engage with superior Allied planes at this point. Allies are in Paris by August. It goes well. The Allies continue to push and push and push. Um, it is a costly battle. Is we're talking 226,000 Allied casualties, so that's either killed or wounded. Also, something we're going to kind of keep as a running theme here. The start of what they will at the time call combat fatigue, what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, starts to kick in. The Axis powers, so that is the Germans as well as everybody else. They have press ganged in here. So that could be captured Poles, that could be captured Czechs, that could be Austrians, some Italians are all fighting here. The Axis is going to suffer 289,000 casualties roughly. This picture up here are the Allies advancing on Utah Beach. It is taken from a weird angle because the cameraman is under fire as these guys run forward. This is what the basically entirety of the Normandy coast is going to look like within about a week after the D-Day landings for Operation Overlord. Massive amounts of supplies are going to come over from England, and at this point, thanks to the Air Force and our ability to hunt German U-boats, German submarines, we're going to send more and more convoys of our supplies from America over to Europe and continue to let our troops push forward. So that is Operation Overlord in a nutshell, and I do mean in a nutshell. There are entire books written on this. It's fascinating, but we don't have the time, so let's keep rolling. Next up, we've got Operation Market Garden. Operation Market Garden is a disaster. There's no other way to put it. This is why I said earlier I don't like Bernard Montgomery. Bernard Montgomery essentially browbeats General Eisenhower into giving him this pet project. And what he wants to do is go up through the Netherlands, which is north of Belgium and France, and kind of attack Germany from the north. Kind of the reverse of what the Germans had done in World War I and World War II. It is poorly planned out. The airborne landings are in the wrong area. Reinforcements aren't ready. Basically, if you name something bad that can happen, it happens in large part because General Montgomery and the British are too cocky, and the Americans don't really want to poke holes in that. They want to keep the British fighting, so they allow it to happen. It is a disaster. The battle takes place over about a week and a half. 2 weeks, but the aftermath of getting troops out and sort of reorganizing in France and in England basically wastes almost 2 months of the Allies' time from basically October to November. So the battle ends in early October, but through mid-November, the Allies are going to be picking up the pieces of everything that has gone horribly wrong in Market Garden. As we can see here, 16,000 Allied casualties to only 3,000 Axis casualties. This is bad. It is going to result in the Battle of the Bulge, which is the last major offensive action that is going to take place in Europe in World War II. And what's going to happen here is this striped line right here is where the Allies are in Belgium, Luxembourg, and France on the German border prior to the action happening. And what Hitler says is he wants all of the German armies that are left on the Western Front essentially to punch through the Allied lines and make a drive for the coast. Because if they can take out the ports in the Netherlands, then Hitler thinks that he might be able to force an agreement with the Allies. It would make it too hard for the Allies to import supplies, and thus maybe Hitler gets out of this alive. It's effective at first. The Allied troops, the British down here, and the US troops, who are largely most of who's going to get involved with this, get hit hard. You can see a punch here and another punch here. That's December 20th. It is major, major damage. The Allies throughout this battle that's going to last until early January are going to suffer about 89,500 casualties. The Axis will suffer, though, 98,000 because while, I mean, you can see the bulge right here, but what is essentially going to happen is the weather is so bad that the Allies can't get supplies, and they're also freezing. We're talking sub-zero temperatures. The Allies that go into fight, especially around this area, Bastogne, which is what is dealt with in Band of Brothers, are brought in there basically wearing like fall clothes. So we're talking like jackets, no winter clothes really whatsoever, very little ammunition. But pockets like this are going to hold out against the German onslaught and eventually start to push them back. Because around Christmas, New Year's Day, um, in about that week, the skies are going to open up. Allied air cover will come in. It will allow for more scouting. It will allow for supply drops. And then, kind of wrap this all up, in early January, General Patton, who has been given a command again after slapping those soldiers in Sicily, is going to take his Third Army and basically race all the way down from France. Like, if we have this map, he's coming from like over here, and they're racing and they're going to come up here. And this is with tanks, with thousands of troops, and help the troops who've already been there repulse the Nazis and push them back. Um, the Nazi punch worked, but long story short, they overextended their supply lines. They went so far so fast that they ran out of gas and bullets, and their supplies couldn't catch up to them by the time the Allies got everything together and were able to punch back. So essentially, by mid January 1945, the Nazi armies are in retreat behind the Rhine River, which forms the western border of Germany. Now, one of the questions that arises is, how do we get these supplies to our guys? Are they just all airdropped? They're not all airdropped. Most of it, and most of Patton's Third Army advance, is helped out by what is called the Red Ball Express. This is a sign that they had up. The Red Ball Express is a largely African American supply unit whose sole job in Europe is to drive gas and supplies over the very few paved roads that existed in northern France into Belgium, Luxembourg, and then eventually into Germany. African Americans, as we kind of saw on the home front, are not particularly trusted due to longstanding racism in America, and it is not believed that they can fight well despite ample evidence to the contrary. Basically, whenever African Americans are given a chance to fight, they do a bang up job and they fight just as well as anybody else. But racism being racism, that's not actually going to solve any problems. So the Red Ball Express is going to be incredibly influential in keeping those supplies and eventually fueling the tanks of Patton's army up to the Battle of the Bulge. And then afterwards, as we advance into Germany, they will continue to truck supplies from the landing spots that we initially saw after Operation Overlord was completed, and then from the Dutch ports as well. Another thing that bears mentioning, and there's no one place to put it because they're part of the larger Air Force at this point, but the Tuskegee Airmen, who you may have heard of before. There was a movie called Red Tails a couple years ago. That's another one that I'll let you do for your movie if you want. They are African American pursuit pilots, which means that they are going to be the ones that go after planes that attack our bombers and our supply transports. They flew missions all over Europe. They start during the Sicily campaign, and they're going to work through the end of the war in spring 1945. Small unit, but very effective, and puts another big hole in that theory that African Americans are not effective in combat. These are excellent pilots that can go toe-to-toe with anybody else in the Air Force. Okay, we are now going to move locations into the Pacific. All right, I have drastically cut down on the Pacific, which is unfortunately sort of the history of teaching the Pacific. They never get enough time. This map basically shows what we've done so far. So we talked about the Battle of the Coral Sea, we talked about Guadalcanal, we talked about bouncing off of sort of New Guinea, and then going to the Philippines. So the Battle of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf are going to be two battles that happen in relatively rapid succession as General MacArthur and the Army here move up into the Philippines. This is General MacArthur here. We'll talk about him in a second. The Battle of the Philippine Sea basically sees the excellent veteran quality of the American carrier task forces. So those are the big aircraft carrier groups, and we've got tons of them at this point, and their pilots essentially annihilate Japanese carriers once and for all. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is going to happen a little while later, that is literally in the Philippines, is going to see the last attempt of the Japanese Navy to really do any damage to the American Navy. And despite some royal screw-ups on the Americans' part, America essentially emerges relatively unscathed. Leyte Gulf is actually the largest battle of the war, of the naval aspect of the war. And so combining the Battle of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf is going to end any threat from the Japanese Navy. It had already been rendered relatively impotent and not particularly dangerous thanks to the Battle of Midway in 1942. But by the time we get to 44, with the Battle of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy is wiped out at this point. They can't do anything, which means no more resupply for anybody ever. All these little red things you see over here are all battles. We do not have time to talk about all of them, but people who did have time to talk about all of them, puns, you're welcome. I know you missed that, are these guys right here. These are Navajo code talkers. You may have heard of this before. There is a movie starring Nicolas Cage called Wind Talkers. It's not great, but that is also fair game for your movie. Um, the Navajo language is basically unlike any other language in the world, and as a result, if you are not a Navajo, um, there's nothing to compare it to. So it makes it very hard, impossible essentially, to break it. So what the Americans decide to do is to ensure that their actions in the Pacific are not cracked by Japanese code breakers. They're going to bring in a bunch of Navajo military volunteers, and they're going to basically do all the radio talking for the really, really important stuff. And by doing this, they're able to control the information that the Japanese get or don't get and able to move quickly without fear that the Japanese are able to break any sort of codes they had. Because at this point, America has essentially broken all of the Japanese codes. We basically know everything Japan's going to do before Japan even does it. Um, so we've talked about African Americans in the war. We've talked about women on the home front during the war. We've talked about Japanese Americans during the war. This is sort of your ultimate example of Native Americans in the war. This is not the only thing, because obviously there's other tribes other than the Navajo. A large number of them are going to enlist in the Army and the Marines as well, and they will fight in a battle we'll talk about in a little bit. This picture up here, I just threw in here. This pilot shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in one flight during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. By the time we get here, we sort of talked about this back with Midway. American airmen have eliminated, largely thanks to the battle at Midway, any veteran Japanese pilots. And as a result, the Japanese, starting with the Battle of Leyte Gulf, actually, are going to start using kamikaze pilots, which are essentially suicide pilots. They are not taught how to land, they are taught how to get up in the air and aim for the decks of carriers that have a bunch of gas or explosives on them and try to blow themselves up and take out the carriers. It'll be effective for a little while, and then eventually they will be so unskilled that they're not even doing much damage with that. And also worth pointing out, they did even less damage to British ships over in this area because British ships had steel decks on their carriers. Americans used wooden decks. So when the kamikaze pilots would hit the British carriers, they would literally skip off. Whereas on the US ones, because it was wood, they would get wedged into the deck and explode. So, thanks to the Battle of the Philippine Sea and later the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Philippines and landing grounds on the Philippines are opened up. So, Douglas MacArthur, who we talked about earlier, there's Doug right there, fulfills his promise to return to the Philippines. I note this here because this really needs to be addressed. There's question among historians as to whether or not the Philippine campaign was necessary, because remember, if we look here, the Philippines are not on a direct route to Japan. We could have just as easily gone straight to Okinawa from there, but Douglas MacArthur, as I've addressed earlier, is a massive egotist. He's a good leader, but he's incredibly egotistical, and he wants to retake the Philippines kind of for his own honor more than anything. And this is where we're going to start seeing the Japanese dug in like ticks in every single place they're going to be. They will refuse to surrender. This is a death before dishonor situation here. And as a result, it is going to exact a massive, massive body count on both the Americans and the Japanese. The Army has decided across the Philippines that they are going to eliminate all of them and restore those airfields so we can continue to bomb Japan and move our troops closer and closer to the Japanese home islands. But just to put this in perspective, with the Japanese not surrendering, the Philippine campaign is going to take 68,000 American casualties. But it's going to take 419,000 Japanese troops. Most of them are going to be killed. As we go further here, you will see the massive number of Japanese that this is going to take. Because at this point, it can basically be assumed that the Japanese are not surrendering. So while I'm using casualty numbers, with Americans, it's usually about a 2 to 1 injured to killed. With the Japanese, it's about 99 to 1 killed to injured. The Japanese are not surrendering. So, next up, we've got the Battle of Iwo Jima. You have all seen this picture before. This is the Marine Corps Memorial in Washington, D.C. Iwo Jima is the tiny, tiny little speck of land, but guess what? Why did we land on it? That's right, Dora the Explorer fans. It's because it has an airstrip on it. And that airstrip is going to save hundreds and hundreds of lives um, in the following months because American planes that are shot over Japan are going to be able to sort of coast in to Iwo Jima and get fixed there and then save those sailors. So that is going to be a big deal. But Iwo Jima is the next stop in the island hopping campaign on the way to the Japanese home islands. It's going to take about 2 months. We're talking like February to March 1945. Um, this is essentially a giant volcanic island. It's it's dormant or extinct at this point. Sorry, it's extinct. But the Japanese have dug in everywhere. Um, Out of the 18,000 Japanese, IJA stands for Imperial Japanese Army. Out of the 18,000 that are considered casualties, fewer than 200 actually surrender. The vast majority of them are going to go on suicidal charges. Americans are going to adopt more and more um, brutal ways of dealing with this. So you can see here, this guy, it's kind of hard to tell, but this is a flamethrower right here that this guy has. And basically every single cave will have grenades chucked into it and will be flamed out. As the Japanese are not surrendering, the Americans are basically not looking to take prisoners anymore. They're looking to eliminate the Japanese in any way, shape, or form. And this is going to cost the Americans 45,000 servicemen just to take Iwo Jima. Later on, they will take an island called Saipan, which is famous because the Japanese military, they deny this now, it's pretty well documented though, warn the Japanese civilians that the Americans are coming to rape their women and children and murder the men. And this results in mass suicides of people jumping off the cliffs in Saipan before American interpreters can get in there and say, hey, that's not the fact. We have no beef with you. We're looking to just remove the Japanese army here. Okinawa, the same thing is going to happen. There will be massive civilian suicides on Okinawa. This is the last island before we get to Japan proper. I'm going to go back here just a bit to show you where Okinawa is. So Okinawa is all the way up here. Okinawa is considered basically the first Japanese home island. It's a different culture than the rest of Japan. It's where our military base is now. But at this point, by taking Okinawa right here, there's Iwo right there. So we went from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. And from Okinawa, then we can easily bomb basically all of Japan. And it's also a hop, skip, and a jump to start landing troops in Japan. So, Okinawa is going to take another couple months. So, April to June 1945. It is unrelenting rain. It is a mud pit. Tanks can barely move. It's rocky terrain. The Japanese are hiding in caves. They have underground bunkers. They will repeatedly engage in banzai charges, which are essentially suicidal charges at entrenched American positions. Civilians will kill themselves. The Japanese will pretend to surrender and then blow themselves up, essentially. The Okinawa campaign is going to cost the U.S. 75,000 casualties and the Japanese 100,000 casualties, plus thousands and thousands of civilian deaths as well. After Okinawa is taken, though, the bombing of the Japanese home islands commences in earnest. This map up here is phenomenal. What it's showing here is each one of these cities, what percentage of it is destroyed by Allied bombing, 99.9% US. The British bombing that takes place over here is inconsequential and bad. And it is comparing the size to an American city. So 35% of Osaka is destroyed, which is 35% of Chicago. Tokyo is the size of New York. Almost 40% of that is wiped out. They're using a mix of explosives, but also incendiaries. A lot of Japanese domestic buildings, so like places where people live, are built of wood and paper, so they will just burst into flame. So not only will people be burnt alive, but those fires, the same thing happened in Germany, by the way. These fires would literally suck the air out of the cities because the fire is eating up all of the oxygen, and people would literally suffocate to death despite a lack of smoke. Um, so the bombing of the Japanese homeland is going to intensify in late 44 into 45. The goal is to hurt the Japanese civilians, make them turn against the government and not want the war, but also to absolutely eliminate any and all Japanese manufacturing, which was already in really rough shape. The cities are laid to waste. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese workers are killed along with their families. Factories are destroyed. At this point, there's not a question that America will win the war. It's what price will America have to pay to win the war, and how brutal is that going to get? But American victory is inevitable at this point. Now, I just wanted to bring this up again because it deserves to be addressed, because we don't really acknowledge post-traumatic stress disorder in America until post-Vietnam, really. But it is certainly a thing that is happening here. The inability of the Japanese to surrender, and also the mass suicides of the civilians that we've been talking about, cause massive psychic trauma to our troops all over the Pacific. They're exhausted. It's not healthy there. They're sick a lot. It's wet. As I said, it's muddy. There's battle trauma. They're seeing their friends be killed with alarming regularity. You saw those casualty numbers. And just the unrelenting violence and complete lack of safety, that you can never feel safe around Japan, even on a ship now, thanks to these kamikaze fighters, are going to cause soldiers to break. Some of them will get over it. They will be taken off the front for a couple days or a couple weeks at a time. Again, this also happened in Europe, especially right around D-Day, and again during the Battle of the Bulge. Those troops would be sedated and basically given like a week or two to just rest, and then they'd be sent back to the front. But some of them, it would be so severe that they would have to be basically sedated and taken back to the United States and put in a psychiatric hold for some time. So at this point, the war is winding down. Now, that is not to say it is over. Battles are still happening all over the place, but Allied victory is inevitable. So, 1945 sees what we call the Race to Berlin. This is going to be a mix of strategic bombings, like we saw earlier. This is sort of a poster that the Allies put together as to what the point of strategic bombing is. So it's going to destroy their ability, the Axis ability, to create war materials, but it is also going to reduce their will to resist. So continuing to just hammer away at all times here. The Allies are advancing through what is called the Siegfried Line. Siegfried is a hero of German folklore. And this is kind of like what we saw with the Atlantic Wall. This is a series of bunkers and obstructions to stop tanks from getting through that basically is right behind the Rhine River. So once the Allies actually can get across the Rhine River, then they're running into the Siegfried Line, which is manned at this point by fanatical Hitler youth who have been brainwashed into believing that Hitler is right, and SS, who are basically Hitler's private army at this point. Those are the ones that were also operating the concentration camps. So Allies have a slow advance into Germany after the Battle of the Bulge, but as they advance south into Germany, they are also going to start finding concentration camps. This is the liberation of a concentration camp by GIs here. The Allied leaders knew about concentration camps, but there wasn't much that they could do about it, and when they had options to do stuff about it, they chose not to. Not through any sort of spite, but just for the fear that they might somehow make it worse. They were not aware of the mass executions on the scale that they were happening. They knew something bad was happening, but they did not have a concept of how large the number of people being killed and murdered at this point were. So, as the Allies advance on the ground across the Siegfried Line and through southern Germany, strategic bombings are going to continue to soften up any manufacturing that's happening in Germany. And by now, the Russians are back on the move. They have let all of the Nazis basically kill anybody they didn't like in Poland. Now that it is spring in 1945, the ground is dry enough after the winter snow melt to drive their tanks across again. So you just have a flood of Russians advancing towards Berlin. They're also going to find and free concentration camp victims. At the same time, they will be finding and eliminating, and when I say eliminating, I mean usually executing, any perceived resistance to future Russian rule. Joseph Stalin at this point basically assumes that all of Eastern Europe will be under his control after the war. And that is pretty accurate because of a meeting in Yalta, which is on the Black Sea in sort of the Ukraine area in February 1945. This is a picture of the big three meeting at Yalta. There's Winston Churchill, there's FDR, and there's Joseph Stalin. The big thing to come out of Yalta, and you need to know this, is that the Allies are going to decide to partition Germany. So they're going to slice up Germany after the war into zones of control. They're going to guarantee quote unquote free elections in Poland after the war. Now, they're all aware that there's no way to enforce this because Russia will control Poland and will then throw the election towards the Russians. But at this point, Franklin Roosevelt is fading. He's not really all there anymore. He has a massively enlarged heart. He's pretty sick. He knows that he's not going to be there much longer. And Stalin is able to dictate terms with very little pushback from the Americans or the British. The British are very clearly at this point the third in line here. The Americans and the Russians are dictating what's going to happen during the war. And because FDR just wants to win this war and get it over with, and he's tired and he's sick, he's not going to press back against Stalin's more dictatorial requests at the Yalta Conference. As the Russians move through Eastern Europe, there's no way to put this. It is a tide of murder, rape, and destruction left in the Red Army's wake. Whether or not those people had anything to do with the Germans, it didn't matter. This is a violent catharsis for the Red Army after 5-6 years of just constant warfare. 8:30. Finally, that date is wrong. That should not say 8:30. That should say 4:30. My bad. I apologize. The Russians are going to be inside Berlin. The Hitler Youth, we're talking like kids the age of freshmen, are fighting off the Russian army at this point. It's not going well. Hitler knows he's going to be captured. The Germans have already lost. This is the Reichstag. This is the capital building of Germany at this point. The Russians have taken it. They are blocks away from Hitler's bunker at this point. Hitler's wife takes a cyanide capsule. He shoots his dog Goldie, and then he shoots himself. His minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, is going to kill himself and his wife, but not before they murder all of their children in the bunker. Then they have themselves cremated and in basically a hole in front of the bunker. The bunker doesn't exist anymore. You can't go see it. It's literally a parking lot in Berlin because they don't want people visiting it and making it, a rallying place for the Nazis. So the German army essentially takes over after Hitler's suicide and surrenders to the Allies, which makes May 8th, 1945, what we call VE Day. VE stands for Victory in Europe. The Germans surrender, the Allies are victorious, and now our eyes are going to turn towards Japan. It's going to take a little bit, but over that summer, the US and the English are going to prepare to invade the Japanese home islands and start transferring troops out of Europe and over to the Pacific Theater. In July, we are going to have what is called the Potsdam Conference. Potsdam is a neighborhood in Berlin, and all of the Allied leaders are going to meet up there. So here's Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill will be actually voted out in the midst of the Potsdam Conference. He won't be the Prime Minister of England anymore. There's Harry Truman. He takes over after Franklin Roosevelt dies of a cerebral hemorrhage at his vacation spot in Georgia. And there's Joseph Stalin still just chugging along. So the Potsdam Conference is basically just going to make sure that everybody's still on the same page as Yalta. Truman gets to meet with Stalin and Churchill for the first time. They reassert everything we just covered for Yalta. It's also going to force Soviet citizens back to the USSR. This will end badly because most Soviet citizens that got out of the USSR, even if that was being turned into like forced labor in Germany, don't want to go back because the USSR is terrible. And also, as we will find out later, Stalin is going to send those people to Siberia or murder them because he doesn't like that they've seen what the world looks like outside of his bubble of communist Russia. One thing worth mentioning here, and this is sort of our cliffhanger before we get to our last video, is Harry Truman does not mention that we have access to the atomic bomb. Now, thanks to spies, the Russians are well aware of this. The British have helped us do this. They don't talk about it. But at this point, the Russians have committed to helping us invade Japan. But Harry Truman has realized that he doesn't really want the Russians to get there because then we might have to give them part of Japan after we take it. So that's going to do it for us today. We've got one more video coming in the next day or two that will go over the use of the atomic bomb and the direct aftermath of World War II. As always, questions in here. And have yourselves a good day. Keep washing your hands. Stay healthy. Stay safe. Adios.